So to finish off with the intellectual attitudes, the authorities, they were sometimes called the prophets. The Victorians used the word prophets to mean not only religious leaders but also these kinds of intellectual, philosophical leaders. So big names like Thomas Carlyle or Matthew Arnold or John Ruskin, they might be called prophets. What they also believed in, so another Victorian word, is the natural law. The natural law was a concept, probably refuted by now, that if you were an expert in one area of knowledge, like history or art or politics or philosophy or economy, you would automatically be an expert in all others, especially those referring to social life. So being an expert in one field automatically made you an authority who could be asked any question, including how to live. And those Victorian intellectuals used this position of authority immensely. Some say, like Walter Houghton really, that it was a very great opportunity for them to boost their ego. So they enjoyed being venerated and idolized by their fans. That it really reflects a kind of romantic way of thinking, in which you have the geniuses who are rare and should be venerated, and everybody else who should become a follower of a genius. So if you believed yourself to be a genius, of course it boosted your ego, but as cases of, I guess, all of these people, Thomas Carlyle and John Stuart Mill and John Ruskin and many other eminent Victorians, like Cardinal Newman, for example, another great religious philosopher who converted to Catholicism in the end. But this leads sometimes to anxiety and mental problems for these figures of authority as well. All these great Victorians that I mentioned now had either moments of complete nervous breakdown that left them incapacitated for a time and they then recovered, or sometimes, like John Ruskin, towards the end of his life, never recovered from what the contemporaries understood as madness. So this could actually drive you mad if you were a genius. So yes, again, something interesting. John Ruskin is an interesting character in general. He was involved in some great achievements like his work on Turner or the Pre-Raphaelites, but also social scandals. You may want to Google the disastrous story of his marriage to Effie Gray and the very scandalous annulment of this marriage when, after 5 years of being Mrs. Ruskin, Effie decided to petition for the annulment because she was still a virgin. And why was she still a virgin? This was a matter of gossip. Yeah, we might want to talk about it when we meet. So poor John Ruskin continued a very good university career, but the last bout of his illness really took him when he was lecturing. So he was taken down from the lecturing stand and moved to his house in the Lake District, where he lived for a few years but never really regained contact with reality. So this is a difficult thing really, to be a Victorian intellectually. Another thing which is very typical for Victorian intellectual attitudes is hero worship. This is something absolutely crucial for understanding Victorian way of thinking. If we think of, let's say, the attitudes towards history, I will tell you about Thomas Carlyle. again, a very interesting intellectual. He believed that, to quote from him, great men are profitable company. So the progress in history is done through great individuals. So basically the history goes its own way, then a genius appears. A genius could be in different fields. It could be a scientist like Leonardo da Vinci. It could be a great military leader. Some kings and queens like Henry V or perhaps Elizabeth I were venerated in this way. Or it could be a religious leader like Prophet Muhammad, who was believed to be a great religious leader by the Victorians as well. It's not a part of history that was unknown to them. So, or great artists like Michelangelo, and they promote a kind of mini revolution that lifts the level of civilization upwards, and then it goes its own way, but from a higher level, until the next genius appears. We have a lot of publications produced in the Victorian period about biographies. So usually these are historical biographies or of kings and queens, but also engineers. It didn't have to be very old history. These could be engineers, these could be men who expanded the borders of the British Empire. Great military commanders such as Wellington or Lord Nelson. And even basically people who succeeded in the trades. So people like, for example, Josiah Wedgwood, an 18th century innovator in the pottery business, who created a very successful firm making ceramics, Wedgwood firm. I think it still exists. All this was a kind of motivational biography. If you read about the contemporary figures especially, this would very often include the element of self-betterment. So there was this poor but talented lad. He struggled hard. He read books at night rather than sleep, and he worked and saved up the money to go to school. So he improved himself. He improved his destiny, really. So this is extremely popular form of talking about history in the 19th century. Another thing that's absolutely fascinating for the Victorians are mythologies. It could be, of course, classical mythology, Greek and Roman, and still you have a lot of people very interested in that. It could be Christian mythology, so the lives of saints. It could be national mythology, so the stories surrounding King Arthur, for example, become very popular. The Knights of the Round Table, and generally the concept of knighthood, and we have this kind of mythologizing vision of history as well. We have great interest in more exotic mythologies, Norse, Germanic, Indian. So a lot of books are printed on these subjects. A lot of art is revolving around these subjects. So we have this romantic vision of history as the history of great people, and we have this kind of need for mythology, perhaps to some extent to replace religious beliefs, but sometimes functioning beside religious beliefs. So this is at the level of the culture as a whole, but also at the level of individuals. So people start making up the list of their personal heroes. A very famous example is the Pre-Raphaelites, a group of young artists in the middle years of the 19th century. They decide to come up with a new artistic movement, which would be more honest and sincere, and to use very, very Victorian words, they would display earnestness and enthusiasm. So earnestness meaning this kind of serious and honest attitude towards whatever you do in life, self-improvement mostly, moral issues as well, and enthusiasm meaning a kind of joyous, optimistic attitude which corresponds to it. So they made a list, they made a manifesto of what they are going to achieve through their paintings. But one of the other things they did was the list of immortals. They called them the list of immortals. So they made a list of people who inspired them. It's quite a long list, but the names very high on this list, those who got like the most votes from the members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The first one on the list is actually Jesus Christ, still, so religious morality, but especially this kind of heroic reading of Jesus Christ is very important. The next one is Shakespeare, of course, because the Victorians had two holy books, the Bible and the works of William Shakespeare. Then we have the author of the Book of Job from the Old Testament. This story that you may recall about a patient man who was tried by God and he never failed. Then some other people like King Alfred, one of the early medieval rulers of Britain. Dante, of course, Rossetti, Dante Gabriel Rossetti could not miss including Dante. Homer, Boccaccio, Chaucer, Leonardo da Vinci, Goethe, Keats and Shelley, but also people like George Washington. So you might say the enemy of Britain, but still a great military leader. Kosciuszko is on the list as well, but not very high. Plus a few more people, but it gives you the idea. So we have some artists, we have some let's say influential people from history, and having a list of such heroes, personal heroes, becomes a very, very popular thing in Victorian times. You might want to ask yourself, like, who would there be on your list of heroes, and could you still be able to pinpoint, like, these are exactly, I don't know, 5 or 10 people I admire and I am influenced by. For the Victorians, this was one of the first questions they asked themselves. And then we go to the moral attitudes. So emotional attitudes, intellectual attitudes, and now the moral attitudes. And the moral attitudes revolve mostly between two subjects. The two subjects concerning Victorian virtues, that is the subjects of work and love. Work and love as understood by the middle class. So the most important aspect of Victorian views towards morality was that although the expectations regarding morality were more or less the same for men and women, in theory, the practice would be somewhat different than the theory. That is, we have like a general morality for everybody, so both work and love related moral issues would be important for men and women, but because the Victorian society is so deeply based on the concept of the division of spheres, that is strictly defined gender roles, so social roles typical for men and women, that, let's say, men's morality is more concerned with work and women's morality is more concerned with love. Love meaning family and sexuality. Work meaning all kinds of virtues relating to professional life, to life outside of the home. So the area of life that was more relative to men than to women. And these would be things like, of course, hard work. The very idea that work has moral value, that work is not, as the Ancien Regime and the feudal society believed. Work in the Bible was a punishment. When Adam and Eve sinned and they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, they were punished by God. Adam had to work and Eve had to bear children in pain. This was the punishment. And there was nothing moral about work. It was just the means of repentance. For the Victorians, work is so important that it is not the payment for the sin, the form of atonement, but the means through which the soul is saved. This is what the Victorians believed. So even if you were rich enough not to work, you should try to find some sort of useful occupation for yourself to be useful to the people, to be useful to the society, because work is such a moral thing and idleness is immoral. So that is why, for example, the upper class who did not have to work, and even the highest sections of the upper middle class who did not have to work, still looked for some employment. It could be, if you could afford it, to start political life, to go and sit in the House of Commons or in the House of Lords. These were not professions. You wouldn't get any money for it. You could perhaps improve your income through the contacts you made at the Parliament, but the work of the Member of Parliament was not a paid job. This was one of the postulates in the subsequent parliamentary reforms, to make it possible for those members of the middle class who could not afford to leave their jobs to sit in Parliament because they would lose their income. So for women, the same. If you were an ideal Victorian non-working wife, you should still try to be occupied during the day by managing the servants, by getting involved in charitable works, or at least maintaining social contacts that would improve the social position of your family. So it didn't necessarily mean working for money. It meant not being idle. That is why, for example, we have such popularity of the accomplishment. So little crafts, mostly popular among non-working women, something to occupy their hands, like knitting or embroidery or other crafts, music, something to keep them occupied, something to keep them from being idle. Being idle was very bad. So all the virtues connected with work, punctuality, honesty, keeping your word, honoring your agreements, being a good manager to your subordinates and a good subordinate to your superiors. Of course, if you could, it was better to be a superior than a subordinate, but still you had to do your job truthfully and honestly, and this was a moral thing. For women, it's all around love and family. We will talk about Victorian concepts of family next week, but what do they mean by love? They mean the kind of love that the middle class in the 19th century believed was ideal. So a family with a non-working wife with some servants living with the family, with many children. The average number of children in the Victorian society around the middle of the century is 5.5. So it was expected. It doesn't mean that all families were like that, but this is the ideal. This is the model that the culture was basically aiming to. So the morality of a woman within such family was to be faithful sexually to her husband, to be a good mother, to be a good mistress to the servants, mistress meaning employer, of course, to be a kind, honest, modest person without much extravagance, and generally a very dutiful woman that may be characterized by a very popular title of one of the Victorian long poems by a man called Coventry Patmore. The title is The Angel in the House. The angel in the house, it is the Victorian woman. It is the ideal. The woman who is selfless, who is altruistic, who is kind and meek and modest, and she centers her life on her husband and her children. If we think about the angels in Christianity, there are two things that the angels do. If they are guardian angels, they help the humans and they look after the humans. And in Victorian households, we have a lot of images of little children being guided by an angel, and this angel looks sometimes quite feminine. The other things that angels did in Christianity was to worship God. So my question would be, where was the man in this angelic household? Was he the human to be protected by this superior angelic creature, or was he the god to be worshipped by this subservient angelic creature? And probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. Probably depends from one family to another, but the ideal was again dual. It was kind of conflicted in the middle. So at the same time, a woman was very often presented as a more moral creature than a man, especially in relation to her being not spoiled by the outside world, by the competition, by the kind of a ruthless business-like environment. And on the other hand, she was treated like a perpetual child, someone who was lower in terms of the intellect especially. So she needed the guidance of the man, which is reflected very much, for example, in the legal position of women, especially married women, being completely dependent on their man. So once again, these two things, work and love, were true for both men and women. But because of the practice of division of spheres, the work-related morality was more important for men, and home and love and sex-related morality was more important for women. So it was easier to forgive a man if he had a mistress than if he was a thief. And the opposite for women. It was easier to forgive a woman if she wasn't very honest, let's say she stole something, than if she had an extramarital an affair with another man. So she was not the faithful wife. The worst thing you could call, the worst insult you could call a Victorian man, I read somewhere, was to call him a thief or a cheat. So to question his work-related morality. The worst thing to call a woman always was a whore. So to question her sexual morality. So as you can see, this is really the concept of Victorian virtue. And that's more or less it. If you want more, Walter Houghton, The Victorian Frame of Mind, and David Newsom, to some extent, the Victorian World Picture. And in a moment I will very briefly tell you a little bit more about Victorian religion. So we continue in